Even before I was even in the double digits, I was about 8 years old when we began our health journey. And it was through my mom having a health crisis. And the Lord has kind of taken us on a unique journey throughout the years. And there's always more to learn. Tonight I'm going to be presenting to you the GMO presentation, which, as Sabrina heard me share my story about this last week when we were in Monroe, it was the topic that I really did not want to present on. And my mom had asked me to write up a presentation on it, and I was like, oh, Mom, I really don't want to do that one. I mean, I present on all different types of things, but the GMO one wasn't one that I was very keen on doing. So I made her a deal. I said, well, if we are asked to present it, then I will develop a presentation for it. And not much longer, there was a church out east in New Hampshire that we were asked to speak at. And they said, hey, do you have a presentation on GMOs? And I said, no, I don't. And they said, could you? And I said, yes, I can do that. And so it answered my mother's prayer and her heart's desire. And it was an amazing journey sitting there. I actually kind of locked myself in a room. We went to my grandmother's house. And for the weekend, I just literally sat in a room studying over and over and over again. My grandmother was like, are you ever coming out of that room? I said, yes, but I have to prepare for this presentation. And even when I went down out east, there's always more things coming out. And so it's like every time I go to present this topic, my notes just get longer and longer and longer, to where, honestly, if you look at this stack, it's like there's no way in the world I could do that in an hour. And so you get bits and pieces of what all is in my head, and what I see are the highlights of things for you to know. I would encourage you, after the presentation, go home and study. Look up the information. Go back, be Bereans, and study it out and see what is really going on in our world. Because it's one thing to have somebody stand up and tell you. It's another to go and study it out. And the best way to learn the information is to take notes, write it down, and then try and share it with somebody else. And then you'll learn, okay, this is how much I really got, and this is what I need to know better. So before we begin, let's have a short word of prayer, and then we'll go into our presentation. Gracious Father in heaven, Lord, I thank you that you gave us minds to think and to reason, and that you have told us to come, let us reason together. Lord, I ask that you would be with the presentation, that you would help us to see you as the God of creation, and to see how you have designed our bodies to run, and that you desire more than anything for us to be in physical and spiritual health. So please help the presentation to be clear, and help us to go away equipped and educated to know how we best can take control of our health. In your holy name, amen. Amen. All right, so how many in here are not familiar with what a GMO is? Anybody not even know what the GMO actually stands for? GMO stands for genetically modified organisms. And you know, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's been a trend the last decade or so of diseases increasing exponentially. It used to be that this person might have had a disease, or that person had it, or somebody else, but now it seems like everybody knows somebody who has at least 1, 2, or if not 3 chronic diseases. And we ask ourselves, as we see the scale just shooting through the roof, what is going on in our world, especially what is going on in our country. And we have to think, I mean, there's a few factors, but one major thing that has come in is the genetic engineering of food. So what is GMO? What is genetic engineering? Well, I figure sometimes the best ways to find out what things are is to go to the source of the creators themselves, and then use their information to see whether it's actually what they suppose it should be and how beneficial it really is. So this is how the creators of GMOs, define it. They say it is the unnatural process of taking genes from one species and forcing it into the DNA of another species. So they are swapping genes between the normal species barrier, creating new organisms that were not part of how God created things to be. In Genesis 1, we have God created the apple trees, He created the pear trees, He created the zebras, He created the giraffes, and He created it, and in Genesis 1, if you read it, it says, God created like producing like. Okay, so you don't have a monkey that has a lion. You don't have an apple tree that bears mangoes. That would be great in Michigan. But that just doesn't happen. You plant an apple seed, you get an apple. You plant a peach tree, you get peaches. Because God created it to produce like after producing like. Animals produce like. And what happens in the animal creation when we try and make two animals to mate that are not like after like? We get an animal that cannot procreate. Right? So God created some species barriers there. And what the GMOs are is they're crossing those species barriers that God created because they want a specific outcome. So some examples is they have a goat gland with spider gland or spider gene, and they combine it so that you milk the goat and you get kind of like a silky texture out of it. And you can use that for like bulletproof vests. They mix the cow with pig, so you get a pig with a cow hide, you get human and corn, and that's how you get spermicide. And all different types of things. Those are just some of the random things out there. But how we see it and what we're going to focus on this evening is how it is in the plant world. And there's two basic plant forms of genetically modified organisms. There's the herbicide resistant, which is where they take the gene and they make the gene of the corn, or actually in this case it's the soy. They make it to where they put part of the gene of the Roundup into the gene of the soy, so that when you spray the Roundup, the seed will recognize it as, oh, this is fine, and it will not die. I'll go into the science of it in a minute. Now the pesticide forming is where they put the pesticide into each cell of the plant, so that when, let's say, an insect comes, and this is with corn and cotton. So let's say an insect comes, bites a little bite out of the corn, and so it goes into its mouth, it goes into its stomach, and it will cause formaldehyde and ammonia, which will burst open the stomach by breaking holes into it, and it will kill the insect. Now this isn't the pesticide that they're spraying on it. This is what they have now made the food itself to be. So they're making the plant a pesticide itself, so that the plant can do the killing rather than having to spray something on that will do the killing. See any problems with the thought of that? So how do they make it? Well, what happened was that Monsanto noticed that there was this pool of chemical waste dump that actually had a bacteria growing in it that could survive the Roundup. And I thought, oh, there's a bacteria that can survive Roundup. Let's harvest it and put it in the food supply. So that's what they basically did. And so they took the gene out of the bacteria that could withstand the Roundup, and then they mutated it, and they took part of it, and they duplicated it. They put it into via it's a complex process. But basically, they took the gene that they wanted, which was the Roundup-resistant bacteria, which must be a pretty strong bacteria to resist spraying Roundup and all the other chemical waste that were kind of going off of this field. And they multiplied it, they put it into a gun, and they shot it into a plate of millions of cells, and then they cloned the cells into a plant. If you want the more scientific definition, I can give it to you afterwards, but it's pretty complex. So now in order to turn on this new function, they need something to kind of get it into the cell. They need to be able to turn it on, and our bodies got created to be able to kind of fight off this through the immune system. And so they use either a virus or a bacteria that is resistant to antibiotics to be able to get it to force its way into the cells. So that happens, and then when they turn it on, it turns it on high permanently, and this new gene, who knows what in the world it's going to do. Now, is this process safe? Well, no, it isn't. This process was actually designed off of a theory which was called the one-gene theory, and it was a theory that was debunked in 2002 because they had this thinking that one gene produced one protein and had one function. So if we take this one gene and we insert the GM DNA into it, then it's just changing that one function of that one strand of DNA of that one gene, and it's not going to impact much. But what they found in 2002 was each strand of DNA makes hundreds of different proteins and has hundreds of different functions based on where it is in the lineup of the strand of the DNA. So now they have found that based on where you insert it can have a whole host of impact of which we do not know. So there was a study done in Europe where they tried to insert it in the same exact spot in each line of the DNA makeup, the strand, and they couldn't get it right. I mean, just think, you've got this tiny, minuscule, microscopic thing, and you're taking this gene gun and just shooting it in, hoping that it'll end up in the same place. I mean, it's almost like, I'm trying to think of how to express it. I mean, you've got the world, and you drop a marble on it and think that every time when you're out in outer space, when you drop a marble, it's going to hit in the same spot. It's just not going to work. And that's what they have found, that it's very unpredictable. And they can't scientifically make it work the same way every single time. So what they found is that when they do this, the process itself mutates the genes, cuts off parts of the genes, and they found that it actually changes up to 5% of the DNA that it is inserted into. Which is, if you look at the amount of DNA and the impact that it can have, is quite a bit. They have found that it causes a lot of allergies, it causes a lot of toxins, just the process in and of itself, even if what they were inserting into it wasn't a toxin alone. Does that make sense? The process itself of genetically modifying and putting a piece of DNA into another piece of DNA that wasn't supposed to be there, in and of itself is dangerous, let alone the fact that what they're putting in is herbicides and pesticides and poisons. So because this is a process and it inserts something into the body that is not naturally in nature, what system in our body has been created in order to fight off foreign invaders? The immune system, correct. So when we eat something that is genetically modified, it goes into our body and our body says, warning, warning, I know what an apple is, I know what corn is, I know what a soybean is, but what in the world is this? Because it has a part of DNA that is not originally part of it. So our body sends out this immune response, and what happens when your immune system goes after something? You get inflammation. And inflammation is the precursor for just about every disease that there is. So not only are we eating something that isn't natural, we are now putting into our body something that's going to send our immune system on high and on alert anytime it enters into our body. So what they have found is that inflammation is the precursor for things like endocrine disruption, inhibits mineral absorption, it messes with our GI bacteria, many GI disorders, heart disease, diabetes, infertility, autism, depression, leaky gut, and allergies, just a small list of things. So what's going on with this? In 1992, the FDA said, hey, look, it looks the same as food. It's exactly the same as food. No need to test the safety of it. It looks like an apple, nowadays. It looks like an ear of corn. It looks like soybeans. So let's not test it. I'm sure it's fine. And let's just put it out into the public. They said there's all their testing they did, everything came out fine. So why do you need to have big, long tests? Well, in 1998, there was a lawsuit that forced 44,000 pages of unreleased testing documents out that actually show that the FDA had been covering things up. And that most of the scientists that were involved in the testing, even the short testing they had done, said this is not safe. And they said, no, this is actually, it can lead to allergies, toxins, new diseases, and many nutritional deficiencies. So please don't release it. And yet they said, no, that doesn't really fit what we want, so we're just going to hide those studies. And if anybody dared to actually bring them up in public, they would lose their jobs, be threatened, and all such sort of things. So the FDA has in the history told us that PCB was safe and that DDT was safe. And have we found since then that they were safe or that they were unsafe? Unsafe. So they have kind of a history of being questionable at best. So what manners and what methods did they use to bring GMOs into the world and into the food system? And how did they say that they were actually going to help? Because if they marketed and said, look, we're going to put poisons into the food that's going to cause all these hosts of disease, do you think that anybody would ever use them? No, so that can't be their marketing front. So what they did is they said, hey, look, this is our way to feed the world. We've got starving people all over the world. This is going to increase crop yield. This is going to help the poor farmers. This is going to solve all the problems. It's going to deal with drought and diseases and all sorts of things. They also said, hey, look, it's going to decrease herbicides and pesticides use because you got it being herbicide resistant, so you only need to spray it on once, so it'll just kill all the weeds and you won't have to worry about it. And also, the plant itself is a pesticide, so we shouldn't have to spray pesticides on it if the plant itself is one. That would make some common sense, thinking that that would actually work. And they also, one of the reasons that they wanted to bring them in is that a lot of people, there's this trend nowadays not to get vaccinated. And they said, well, in order to deal with that, we could just make edible vaccinations. And so we'll just start putting things in the food without letting people know, and then they'll get vaccinated that type of way, and they'll get pharmaceuticals through their food. Thankfully, that has not passed. It's amazing what people can put into our food without even letting humanity know what we're eating it. So now we're going to go through the list of their claims and see have they actually come true. So first, less pesticides and herbicides. Well, just to throw out a number, in the first 16 years there was an increase of 527 million pounds of herbicide use just in our country. That's a lot of pounds of herbicide. The main herbicide that they use is Roundup, which the main compound is glyphosate, which we'll go into detail on a bit later. So they thought that they wouldn't have to spray as much. And before 2007, that actually worked quite a bit. It worked to not increase as much, even though they did have an increase of 38%. But it wasn't as much as what they were expecting. But post-2007, it just skyrocketed. And why? Because can man ever outsmart God? No. And it's amazing what God put into the plants and into the insects is they started developing stronger weeds. And so they had to put more and more herbicides on it and more herbicides because the weeds were actually getting to where they were not being killed off by the Roundup. Now the government has had to constantly increase their level of the residue that they allow on the foods to kind of make up for the fact that they've had to increase the pesticide and herbicide use. The pesticide use never really kind of panned out. They needed more. They always needed more than what they were expecting to. And if you look at GM versus non-GM, it's 28% more than what the non-GM, even the conventional varieties need. So it's interesting that even if you spray it conventionally and you're not growing organic, the GM itself needs more than the non-GM varieties. So if you compare it, they don't work. There are now 70 million acres that are resistant to the pesticides and the herbicides, the BT and all the different hosts of not only Roundup but the other herbicides that they spray on because they've built up an immunity to it. So it's an interesting thing that they're finding that it hasn't worked. Now, if you look at the new thing that happened, because, okay, so let's say this is what happened. They thought, the people who were releasing it said, all right, you're going to need less, and so this is going to be healthier. The scientists said, no, what's going to happen is that the weeds, we're going to get stronger weeds than before, and you're going to end up needing something stronger. You're going to get it's going to kill off the more sensitive insects, but the bad insects are going to develop some sort of an immunity to it, and then we're going to need something stronger. So this really isn't a wise plan to follow. But the FDA said, no, it's going to be fine, let's do it anyways. And so they did. And what they found is that over 7 to 8 years, exactly what the scientists who knew what things would happen, the agriculturalists knew would happen, it happened. You have super bugs, you have super weeds. There are 500 bugs and 21 species of weeds that are resistant to what they're actually spraying. So what do? They just say, oh, well at first they were saying just spray more of the pesticides and the herbicides on it and that'll take care of it. And it hasn't. So they decided, you know what, we've got a new line. Monsanto was the one who had the Roundup ready. So now Dow Chemical came and said, hey, we're going to save the day. And we have this new seed called the Endless Duo. And the Endless Duo, we are going to combine glyphosate, which is Roundup, and we're going to use 2,4-D, combine those, put them in the seeds, and spray them on, and that is what is going to be our way to get rid of the super weeds and the super bugs. Does anybody know what 2,4-D is in here? 2,4-D is one of the two agents that they used in Agent Orange.
Oh.
Okay, so that is now what they are putting into the food and spraying on the food in levels more than anybody would want to imagine. They are tripling the spraying of it by 2020. They've increased the use of it sevenfold by the first decade. They actually just released this a couple years ago. Now, it's an interesting thing. I looked up some articles, and in the Chicago Tribune, it talks about the levels of 2,4-D and what they tested on. You know, they always use the poor rats. And they found that under 5 milligrams per kilograms over a 2-year period, most rats didn't have issues. Now, Dow says that it's safe at 21 milligrams per kilogram. So if you look at the difference, 5 milligrams per kilogram is what the scientists found, but Dow says, no, those studies were wrong. We're going to say that it's safe at 21 milligrams per kilograms, which is now over 40 times the amount than what they actually found safety levels at. So they have the allowable daily intake set at 0.21 milligrams per kilogram, which is anything but actually safe. And the Dow plans to add traits to corn and soybeans so that they can survive being sprayed with weed killers from up to 17 different chemical families. 17 different chemical families is what they are wanting to put into the seeds to make resistant. So now what is that meaning for us? That they're going to be putting chemicals from those different families in the food so that they're now resistant. I have this presentation recorded and I call it edible pesticides because it seems like that's what they've created. Even though it's not really food, it looks like food, it smells like food, it even tastes like food, but it's really just a whole host of chemicals. So in 2002, the average herbicide use was 1.54 pounds per acre, and in 2012 it had doubled. So we're looking at, okay, did it work? No, 2012 was the most recent data point that I could get. So it had already doubled in 10 years. So imagine what it's done in the next 4 years, what has happened. It's a scary time to go out and get food and knowledge. So the 2,4-D, when we look at the glyphosate in and of itself had a lot of issues, and we'll go over that in a moment. But the 2,4-D, I heard from a lot of people when they were talking about bringing out the 2,4-D, is that it makes glyphosate look like drinking water. The difference between 2,4-D and glyphosate, one of them, not just the strength of it, is the glyphosate wasn't so much, it didn't go into a gas or be as airborne, whereas the 2,4-D can drift for miles. There was this one farmer that they had grapevines. And they found out that their neighbor was going to spray 2,4-D, and they said, please don't, because I know I'm a few miles from you, but you could ruin my vineyard. And the person said, oh, no, it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine. They said, no, if you ruin my vineyard, you have to cover it, because you are spraying something that you know will kill the delicate plants of certain fruit types. And sure enough, the farmer sprayed it, and it drifted through the air, and it just totally destroyed his vineyard, and then he went, and the farmer had to take care of it. So it flies through the air a nice long distance, so it's not something that you can just put on and it stays there. And anything that they use in Agent Orange and those types of things, I don't really know that we want to be spraying all over the potential 154 million acres in our country. We just did a 2-week road trip, and it's amazing. You drive through Iowa, and you're just surrounded by these GMO cornfields. We went through Oklahoma because we have friends who live there. And there's just GM cornfields everywhere. And I think, wow, I am grateful that we're not surrounded by this, because they find that people who are surrounded by it end up with a whole host of diseases just because of what they're exposed to, even if they didn't eat it themselves, because of what they're having sprayed all around them and breathing and rubbing up against too. So has it fed the world? Very quickly, no, it has not fed the world. There are over 250,000 farmers that have killed themselves who have been planting it over in poor countries like India because they can't afford it. They get stuck under the debt of buying all these expensive chemicals, buying all the seeds, because they don't allow you to save the seeds because they patented them. And so they're stuck, they don't know what to do. So Forbes has actually said that every 30 minutes a farmer in India commits suicide. And most of them do that by drinking the chemicals that they were going to be spraying on their plants. Deadly. deadly, and it is just devastating to see what this is doing. So where they're saying, look, this is how we're going to feed the world, this is how we're going to save those poor farmers, it's actually bringing a lot more devastation than good, but of course that's not what the news will tell us. So are they disease resistant? No. It's amazing when you know farmers, which I am not. When you know farmers, they say the best way to get disease resistance is to feed the soil. You get healthy soil, and you won't get the bugs. You won't get the diseases. It's amazing. We're trying to be farmers. We're trying to be gardeners first. And you get bugs, and I'll send pictures to my friends and be like, what is this? What is that? And they're like, okay, it's an obvious symptom of letting you know that your soil is deficient in something. Because if it wasn't, your plant would be healthy. If your soil was healthy, then you wouldn't have the bugs. The bugs come and feed on the diseased plants. Oh, wow. What an amazing thing. And so, no, they are not disease resistant. They find that in times of drought or in times of too much water, they do much, much worse than the normal grown plants. Side by side, they have no comparison. When they kill the soil, they kill the nutrients to be able to give health to the plant and health to whatever is eating the plant. So no, they have not been disease resistant. The diseases are just getting, unfortunately, stronger and being able to overtake the GM and everything they put into it. So how has it come to our tables? It was first introduced in the markets in the middle of the 1990s with a Flavor Saver tomato. And they brought it in as a tomato that didn't bruise. Well, it had an aftertaste and people didn't like it, and so they took it off because the market didn't go anywhere. Since then, they've gotten a lot smarter to where you can't tell the difference in the flavor of the food when you do comparisons. At least we as humans can't. Animals tend to be able to tell the difference, but we as humans can't. So since they introduced it in about 1996, corn, they now have 33 varieties of GM corn, and it is about over 90% of the corn out there is genetically modified. Soy, there's now 20 varieties, and that's about 94% of the soy. Cotton, about 93%, and there's 16 varieties of it. Canola, they say 93%, but I have found from many studies that it's all been contaminated. So canola is no longer safe, whether it says organic or not, because every field they test has been contaminated. Sugar beets, over 95% of them, so basically anything that says sugar, if it's not cane juice crystals, is pretty much a guarantee that it's genetically modified. They have the Hawaiian papaya, which is over 80%. We were in Hawaii 4 years ago, and there were signs all over the islands. We went to 3 different islands while we were there, and it was like, get Monsanto out of our country. I mean, it's amazing when you watch Monsanto's advertisements for the Hawaiian papaya and all the good that they've done, and then you go to Hawaii and you see what the people think about what Monsanto has done to their beautiful islands. It's quite a different story. Sweet corn was introduced in 2012. Bananas, they're hoping by 2020. They have some new ones that they just released, which are apples and potatoes, which the thing with them is that they're bruise-free. So I was actually talking to my brother about this today. You can slice an apple, you can drop an apple, and it will be perfectly white for days. Now, that might look pretty, but when you think about it, if you bruise an apple, what's the point of seeing that it's bruised? You know, oh, it's decomposing. I really shouldn't eat it. I mean, do you want to eat rotting food? There's a reason why it turns brown. So you slice it, you bruise it, and it still looks just as firm and just as beautiful as before. And you can eat it and it looks healthy, but it could be totally rotting, but yet it looks great. So they have bruise-free potatoes as well. I mean, because of course nobody wants a brown apple. So let's just mess with the genetic structure of it and make it to where you can leave your apples out for days and they still look beautiful and white. Now the difference with the apples and the potatoes is they're using a different technology for this. And it's called double-strand RNA. And this is a new one. This is the first time that they've actually done this with GMO varieties. And what they do is they take a strand of about 7 to 21 nucleotides, which makes up DNA, little amino acids, And they take about 7 to 21 of them. And they plug that in, and they match the genome to shut down the ability for it to brown or to bruise. All right? So they basically, it goes in and it tries to find its match in the apple and in the potato and whatever else they're going to use this for. Now, we have 3 billion base pairs of nucleotides in our body. Think of the different combinations that you can make up with that. It's endless. So what are the chances that those 7 to 21 nucleotides that they have picked up might just match our DNA sequence? It's pretty much guaranteed. Because when you have 7 to 21 versus 3 billion, with 3 billion you can find any combination that you want to underneath the sun. And so what it does is it'll go and it's going and it's trying to find, it's floating around saying, well, where can I find the sequence to match up to turn off this gene? So now it goes into animals, it goes in, because animals will eat this, humans will eat it, and we have no idea what it could do and what genes it could shut off. Kind of startling, isn't it? Just so we can have apples and potatoes that don't bruise. So they fed this to honeybees, and it was supposed to be harmless, and it changed the expression of 1,461 genes in a tiny little honeybee. And it changed their expressions for weeks. One little meal. So we really have no idea what this is going to do. The potatoes and the apple should start being on the market this fall. They have not been in the market before then, but they will be in the market this fall. So that is their new form of GMO that they are using. So a lot of times we think of this as fruits and vegetables and just the crops. But they also use this in milk. It was in the human growth hormone. And for cheese, I had to learn about this because I never learned about how to make cheese growing up. And they actually get the compound rennin out of the second stomach of a young calf. And that might be a little inconvenient to get, so they've genetically modified that to make cheese. So a lot of times you think, oh, well, you're just safe as long as you avoid certain of the vegetables and the fruits, but it's like, no, it's in the dairy and the cheeses as well. They have GM fish. They have another one which I thought was fascinating is they have GM mosquitoes. You might ask yourself, why do they have genetically modified mosquitoes? Well, they've released them in 4 countries and they want to release them in Florida to help with dengue fever. And what they found when they studied it is that it actually makes it worse. And the people are having horrible allergic reactions when they get bit by these GM mosquitoes. And they said, well, this shouldn't happen because I thought you were only making male mosquitoes GM. Well, about 5% of them end up being female. And they said, but don't worry. We make them all infertile because everything genetically modified they make infertile because they don't want you to be able to save your seeds, and they say so that it can't populate. Well, they said, whoops, sorry, 3% of them actually are fertile, and so you end up with GM baby mosquitoes. And so you wonder what in the world is actually going to happen. So they're having a whole host of issues with the nice GM mosquitoes that they forgot to test before they actually released to the human population. Nice. Now there are several stores that are saying, especially when it comes to the GM fish, this is too far. This is way too far. It's one thing to genetically modify plants, but when you're starting to genetically modify life, that's a bit too much. So there's stores like Kroger, Safeway, all these actually just came out saying they're going all organic and they're going non-GMO, so you can go to their store and pretty much know there's not going to be anything genetically modified in it. Which they're making a stand, which is really nice to see stores actually starting to make a stand and say, I am not going to be selling this anymore because we're finally seeing the studies come out. This is dangerous, and I don't want to give this to the public. So it's amazing what they're doing. Their plan was to, in 1996, they had a plan where a lot of these seed chemical companies like Dow, Monsanto, Syngenta got together, and they said in 5 years we want to have every single seed patented. We want to have them all genetically modified. And so they had this doctor, they gave him $3 million and said, go prove the safety of it. Now how much pressure do you think that doctor was under? Yeah. Quite a bit of pressure. And he was over in Europe, And after this came out that they wanted to patent in 5 years, 95 to 100% of all the seeds that are grown in the world, he came out and he said, let me show you the studies of what I've done. And within a week, he lost his job. He had all of these threats against him. And then, little by little, Europe started saying, okay, maybe we should look at those studies. And it started coming out and coming out. And Europe put a ban on GMO and said, look, this is freaky. We can't do this to our people. Because we're finally looking at the studies. Now, it happened in Europe, but it hasn't happened here. But he was the doctor that put a halt on it going worldwide to saying, look, we're gonna patent every single seed that we possibly can. We're going after it for 5 years. So it slowed everything down. Thankfully, Europe is way ahead than we are in this. And they're kind of holding it because there are certain countries that will not import our GM seeds, our GM plants, and so it's putting us on a little bit of a hold because Americans will take it, but other countries are a little bit more reluctant because they say, well, let's see what happens to the guinea pigs in America, and then we'll see whether we want them in our own countries. So there's a few ethical concerns that come up with this. Number one, they're patenting life. I mean, it's interesting because farmers aren't able to save their seeds. It's illegal to save your seeds, and they're trying to make them infertile so that they won't be able to save their seeds even if they were to try. Does anybody really have the right to create? I mean, God creates, and when we try and mess with it, God kind of has his hand over and says, look, you can try, but it's not going to come without consequences. I mean, look at the consequences that we're facing today. Can only imagine the next generation from us trying to say, hey, look, we want to finally be creator. It's not working too well. Another issue is, if it's so good and so amazing, why won't they let us know what it's in? They spend millions and millions and millions of dollars to prevent the American public from knowing what is genetically modified. Over in Europe and in other countries, they actually have laws that have to say, if something has a genetically modified ingredient on the bag, it says this contains a genetically modified ingredient. We live in a country where this is where they were created. And they are doing everything they can to prevent them. So we have the opposite. We have labels to say something doesn't have a genetically modified ingredient in it, which is the little butterfly one, which we'll show you because I think there might be one or two out there. So that's kind of the fact that we've had to take in the United States as a third-party group said, look, we have the right to know if something is genetically modified or not. So if they're not going to tell us what does, we're going to tell you what doesn't. So, but the question does raise up, why, if it's such a good thing, if it didn't need to be tested for safety, why wouldn't you want to let your people know that that's what they're eating? I mean, it would make sense if you're spending millions and millions of dollars to make this, and you think that's such a great thing. I mean, I was watching Monsanto's commercials for GMO, and if you think it's so wonderful as they say it is, why wouldn't you want to label it? Wouldn't you want the public to know so they could eat this amazingly grown food? So why are they scared to do it? The tide has turned to where now in America, a vast majority of people, if they knew it was in the food, if it was labeled, said this is GMO, they would want it. And they know that, and they know that sales would go down, so they're scared about letting the public know. So they try and hide it. So what are some of the effects on animals and humans? Well, in order to know that, let's go over what these chemicals were actually created to do, and then say, okay, well, that's what they're created to do, and then let's follow that down the line of saying, okay, that's what it does in insects, and then let's follow the line to say what's it going to do to mammals and humans. So glyphosate, which is the key compound in Roundup, was actually patented in 1964 as a broad-spectrum chelator. Does anybody know what a chelator is? Anybody?
It joins together the molecules.
Right. And does it let go of them?
No.
No. No. So basically, it's the molecular level of hugging and not letting go. It's like if you put duct tape on something or Gorilla Glue on something, it's not going to let go of it. It's just kind of stuck there for good. Now, how this works to kill the weeds is it hugs onto all the minerals. And it will not let the plant or the soil have access to them. Now, what happens if you have a plant that has no access to minerals? It also, well, it doesn't have the nutrients it needs to survive. What glyphosate also does is it stops the metabolic process which defends the plant from disease. So it's holding on to all the nutrients, it stops the process that it uses to defend itself, and it promotes disease in the soil as well. So between all those three things, what do you think the likeliness is of the plant surviving? Pretty slim. So then you have a nutrient-deficient plant, which then the animals are fed the nutrient-deficient plant, and the animals are also eating the glyphosate, and so the animals get sick and diseased and are full of all these crazy diseases because they're mineral deficient. And then we as humans eat the plants or eat the animals, and we become nutrient deficient, sickly, diseased, and then we die from them as well. So some of the things that they hold on to, zinc, manganese, copper, all the basic essential vitamins, minerals that our body needs. If you look at the correlation between our health and minerals, we can do okay if we've got about 1 deficiency. 2 deficiencies, we start getting pretty sick. 3 deficiencies, we're really in bad shape before we die. All right, so you look at it, and it's a lot of times we think, oh, we need our vitamins. Well, we actually need our minerals just as much as we need our vitamins. And so what the glyphosate is doing is it's making it to where even if it was in the soil, even if it was in the plant, it's holding on to it where we cannot access it. Something interesting with the glyphosate is the glyphosate causes holes between the cells. What the BT does is, remember how it kills, how it works, because the BT is the main pesticide that they use in the corn, is that it breaks open holes in the cells and the stomach and the gut lining in order to kill the insect. An interesting fact is that our stomach gut lining is only 1 cell thick. When I first heard that, I actually had to go back to my textbook and look and be like, are you serious? 1 cell thick. And so when we are eating things that are breaking open holes in the cells and between the cells, what types of problems comes from that? Lots of problems. Leaky gut, because if you look at our gut, the synapses, the junctions are supposed to be like that. They're supposed to be closed, nothing can permeate it or penetrate it. What happens when we have the glyphosate or the BT is that you have the gut junctions that end up starting to have holes. So let's say you eat something. It goes into your stomach, and then it needs to be broken down into little tiny particles before it can be absorbed into the bloodstream without causing issues. So let's say we have leaky gut, and we have holes in our gut, and the food particles can now go through bigger than what they should have. So now they're leaking into the bloodstream before they should be, and our body says, hey, wait a minute, what is this? This is an invader. So it gets an immune response, and it says, okay, I'm going to remember this for next time, so it builds up some antibodies. It says, but it's a pretty cloudy picture because it's not very clear, and so it says anytime I see anything that looks like that, I'm going to attack it. Now sometimes it might confuse your thyroid, or your pituitary gland, or other parts of your body as that, and so you end up with autoimmune diseases. You end up with allergies because anytime it sees, okay, well that food, because it doesn't have to just be a GM food that floats through. I mean, it could be any type of food particle that's floating through the holes that were created by the GM food or by the glyphosate or by the BT. So you end up with food allergies like crazy. I mean, we have people who are allergic to things that you could never imagine people would be allergic to because we have holes in our gut and the particles are going through. So the American Academy of Environmental Medicine says they urge doctors to prescribe non-GMO diets for all patients. They cite animal studies showing organ damage, gastrointestinal and immune system disorders, accelerated aging, and infertility. Human studies show how genetically modified food can leave material behind inside us, possibly causing long-term problems. Genes inserted into GM soy, for example, can transfer into the DNA of bacteria living inside us. And that the toxic insecticide produced by GM corn was found in the blood of pregnant women and their unborn fetuses. So it didn't just wash away. So some of the things, the diseases that are correlated to glyphosate and BT are infertility, immune dysregulation, accelerated aging, it changes your cell signaling, changes in your liver, kidney, spleen, GI system, and it dysregulates your gene associated with cholesterol synthesis and insulin regulation. Now, infertility, one of the main reasons is because they are trying to make the food infertile. And so they're making the food infertile, they're also trying to make humanity infertile. And And we find that infertility issues are on the skyrocket. I mean, it's amazing what you see. It used to not be like this, but now 1 in every 3 first pregnancies ends in a miscarriage. It's very hard to find people who have not actually had miscarriages. Birth defects are on the skyrocket as well because glyphosate and BT are known to be things that cause birth defects. It's just documented. These will cause birth defects, and that's what they're putting in our food supply. So we shouldn't be surprised at all when we're seeing this. I know in the midwifery world, we're seeing it like crazy. It's amazing the birth defects that we're seeing that we never used to see. So an interesting little side note, animals seem to be smarter than humans in this. If you give animals a choice between GM food and non-GM food, just put it out, they will always eat the non-GM food. And I thought, you know what, they say that, I'd be really curious to see if it actually is true. Well, we didn't intentionally do our own study, but we actually did. One year, we grew a ton of corn. A ton of corn. And my dad, who likes to seed, he was the seeder. He's like, wow, this is really easy to plant corn. So he's going row by row by row. Mind you, there's no water down there. So we have to haul the water in bins and then in buckets and water every single seed that my dad planted so dutifully. And so we babied our corn. All year long, we're just babying this corn because we're going to get an amazing harvest out of our corn. Back-breaking, heat of the day, I mean, it was amazing. So we end up having this beautiful corn crop, but it's not ready to harvest yet. We go down to check on the harvest, and we had some neighbors that we did not realize were down the road. They had planted at a different time as we did, but they planted GM corn. And I thought, wow, theirs looks beautiful, ours looks really pretty too. So we go down to check on our corn because we thought maybe we could harvest some for dinner. And it looked like a battle zone. I mean, seriously, there were ears of corn, and the cows were just everywhere because the raccoons had eaten all of our corn. But our neighbor's GM field corn, their corn, looked beautiful, wasn't touched. And I'm thinking, man, those crazy raccoons, they knew what was better. And so we did our own little study without even trying to do our study. We didn't end up getting any corn that year. But it was a nice little thing to see, wow, animals really are smarter than humans in some cases.
And the crops were only like 150 feet apart.
Yeah, they were not far away. They were very, very close. They've done some interesting correlatory studies where you cannot go with the GM. It's very hard with certain things to say this causes this because there's so many different factors. But they've done some studies and they've shown the increase of 22 different diseases and what has happened since they started introducing GM into the food. And it's amazing to see how they all just start going up, like exponentially, where you have this nice little, like it might be increasing, but it's at the same rate. And then you start introducing, and they show the rate of introducing GM and how much they've increased it, and the lines just start going up. It's amazing to see the correlation. We cannot say that it causes it, but it's a question that would say, what correlation is there when you see both the lines going up pretty much the same? Do you mind holding your question to the end?
Sure.
Thank you so much. So there's certain things like stroke, dementia, Parkinson's, obesity, kidney failure, hypertension, hepatitis C, intestinal infections, autism, inflammatory bowel disease, birth defects, liver and bile duct cancer, thyroid cancer, and so on and so forth. The list continues on and on. 22 of them. I will not stand here and list them all to you. So it's an interesting thing, but what Monsanto always said is, hey, look, it's safe. Because we are working on something to kill bacteria. It doesn't impact cells. So it only disrupts the shikimate pathway for bacteria. So don't worry, humans are fine. It was a very naive at best statement, because for every 1 cell in our body, we have 10 bacteria. So we're actually more bacteria than we are cells. So if it interrupts the pathway of bacteria, it also impacts us. And what is the shikimate pathway responsible for? It is responsible for the production of melatonin, serotonin, tyrosine, dopamine, metabolism of sulfur, the enzymes in our liver, the synthesis and production of our hormones such as estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and a whole host of other things. So can that impact us?
Yeah.
I mean, serotonin, melatonin, tyrosine, they're kind of important things. One thing that's interesting in how it relates to obesity is serotonin is the thing that tells you, hey, I'm full. So if you stop having serotonin levels in your body, you can be eating and eating and eating and never feeling full. And what happens if you don't feel full? You keep eating. I mean, I typically keep eating if I don't feel full. And so you have a lot of issues with mood, aggression, depression, sleep, all sorts of things because this pathway is being interrupted in our body. But they did find in 2002 that it breaks open the holes in our cells just like it does in animals. And so their whole logic of it only messes with bacteria, not cells, kind of went out the window with that one too. So, is there any hope? Yes, there is. It's amazing. I was listening to a presentation the other day, and he sat in a room of, I don't know how many people because they didn't show him. He said, how many of you guys have stopped eating GMOs? And a lot of hands went up. He said, okay, tell me what you have noticed since you stopped eating them. And they started listing all of these things going away. So we have so much more energy. Our brain fog is gone. We can concentrate. We have attention span. Our gut issues have reversed. We're feeling so much better. Our hormone issues went away. It was amazing to listen to the people share the benefits that they personally have experienced from getting off of GM food and going all organic. Because the thing is GM is worse, but if the glyphosate is sprayed on it, you're getting a lot of the same impact as well if it's conventional. So if you don't want the glyphosate and the effects of the glyphosate, you really do have to go organic. So people had all sorts of things, skin issues. It's amazing. When I was in Iowa giving this presentation to a bunch of people that were surrounded by GM fields, well, this could be an interesting group of people to give this presentation to. And they started telling me all the host of skin issues that they had. Allergies, respiratory issues, rashes, terrible, terrible things because of what they were exposed to. And people who stop eating it and they move to places where they're not exposed to it, they go away. And so it's like, okay, there is a correlation, there's a causation factor there. Infertility issues changing. Autism getting better. Whole hosts of things improving from switching from a GM conventional diet to an all-organic diet. There is hope. It is amazing what can happen if we make some choices and make some changes. So it's not all doom and gloom. I know this is a pretty sobering presentation because we're realizing that our bodies are actually being changed into chemical-producing factories. Because what they have found is that the BT, when it goes into our gut bacteria, which I don't know if you've learned or heard lately, but our gut bacteria is very critical. 70% of a child's immune system is in their gut. And the GM, the number one place that it first attacks is the gut. And what it does is it goes in and it hijacks the bacteria that's being produced there, and it produces all bad bacteria, and it doesn't know how to kill E. coli or salmonella. Amazing. It can kill all the good bacteria, but it doesn't kill the bad. Evil. Yeah. And so it's amazing to look and see, okay, for me, some people say, I'd rather not know. Well, I'd rather know rather than ending up sick and dying from all these things and saying, why didn't somebody tell me? I mean, if I could have chosen to be aware, yeah, it's a bit more inconvenient. I will say it is a bit more inconvenient. You learn to read labels. You learn to eat simple. You learn to eat the food as God created and say, you know what, I actually enjoy this. Your taste buds will change. I didn't used to like anything that we eat now. Almost anything. I always liked fruits. I always liked fruits. We became vegetarian and I didn't like vegetables. Then we became vegan and I still didn't like vegetables. That was rough. But you learn. Your taste buds change every 40 days. And I have many times, even to this day, I'll eat something. And I'll be like, I do not like this. But God help me like this because I'm going to eat it because I know it's healthy for me. And I find little by little, I start liking the foods I once hated. And so it's amazing that we can change and you will notice the impact that you have on how you feel now and in the future. I mean, how many of you want to deal with these things? I mean, do you want to deal with cancer, with the obesity, with Alzheimer's and dementia? I mean, who wants to lose their mind? I mean, I don't. And so if we take this into consideration, so you know what, I can equip myself to know, so I can go into the store, and yes, 75% of the grocery store has a genetically modified ingredient in it, and most Americans eat about 193 pounds of genetically modified food a year. But you know what, I'm going to be educated, I'm going to make choices so that I can be healthy. And also, if you don't buy it, then it is sending a sign to the marketers to say, hey, look, this isn't going well. Maybe we should start changing the course of things so we're getting away from genetically modified organisms and getting back to how God created the food to be produced. They have found that when people actually start putting the non-GMO label on, their sales boost 15%. So equip ourselves, educate ourselves, and go and help educate people as well. Because if we have the key to know how to prevent ourselves from having all these diseases, who wouldn't want to share it? And do we really want to say, you know what, I want to have the conveniences of the world and I want to eat anything and everything that tastes good to me? Yep, okay, I want to do that, but I also am knowing that I'm going to increase my risk of Parkinson's, of Crohn's disease, of Alzheimer's, of leaky gut, of all of these things. Does it really sound that appetizing? I mean, think to yourself, next time you go to eat something that's genetically modified, I'm eating BT. I'm eating a chemical that was designed to kill me. And then think, is this really going to taste that good? So it's all about educating our mind and equipping and saying, Lord, what do you want me to do? Because God wants us to prosper physically and spiritually and mentally. And so it is a battle that we live in. Satan wants to kill us. He'll either kill us by one way or another, and food, everybody has to eat. And so educate yourselves and realize, you know what, thank you, Lord, that I am equipped to know how best to have the healthiest and the happiest life that I can have. I think my mom's going to come up and do a little bit of label reading.
Yeah, do you want to answer the question first?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I had just a quick observation. You know, I'm sitting here, listening to this. It's like listening to, an advocate for, against cigarette manufacturers back in the 60s or 70s.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, essentially, it's the same thing. You know, the FDA, the science proves that this is bad for obvious reasons. They have the science. They have the scientific process is there. The studies have been done. It would seem to me they would have to put a label on like they do with cigarettes. You know, this product is harmful for your health. It's something that will encapsulate what you're saying.
Right. You know what's interesting? California has a law that anything that is marked as a known or possible or probable carcinogen has to be labeled.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2015, glyphosate was listed under the probable carcinogen list. And oh man, Monsanto was so upset because now it has to be labeled on everything that it contains something that's a probable carcinogen. But it is something that the FDA and other places are finally saying, I mean, we've got the studies, we've got everybody coming and saying, you have to do this. And they tried suing California for it, and it didn't pass. Because they said, look, we have now scientifically found that it is a probable carcinogen, and our law says we have to label it. They said, no, that's wrong. You're doing this against us. I said, no, this is our law. And so there are people who are finally getting a stand and saying, you know, there's enough people that are against this and realizing the dangers that it's causing, that it is trying to come out and say, look, there's going to have to be labeling on some things to say this can actually cause all these diseases.
Yeah, it seems like the FDA is the root cause. You know, I mean, they have the science.
They do.
And why in the heck would you have a former Monsanto executive being in charge of the FDA? I mean, that's ludicrous.
It is.
That's absolutely crazy.
Monsanto
It
was the nastiest,
Yeah.
most politically well-connected companies in the world.
That's right.
And
It-
I
it's
was
about
in
money.
business and I dealt with them, and they're nasty to